Okay, so for background, my brother Jake is 3 years older, and since childhood, he's been the golden child. He was the varsity football star, the popular guy. I was backstage with the tech crew. I went to a state school for communications and kept volunteering with community theatre. Jake got a real estate license right out of high school and quickly built a career. Theatre has been my passion for a decade. Not because I think I'll make it big, but because it's fulfilling. I work full time as a marketing coordinator, so it's not like I'm living in a fantasy. But Jake never respected it. Every family event, he'd make comments about how I was still playing dress up or wasting time with wannabe actors. He'd compare my little hobby to his six-figure commissions, luxury cars, and supposed sophistication. My parents stayed quiet, and my sister sometimes told him to knock it off, but mostly I felt dismissed. Over the years, Jake built his image as a serious businessman. 2 years ago, he left a big agency to start his own boutique firm. His arrogance grew with every new BMW and expensive suit. The more he bragged about his brand, the more he belittled me. Then came the obsession. About 6 months ago, Jake fixated on a Victorian mansion listed at $1.2 million. Gorgeous 1890s details, original woodwork, stained glass, the works. An elderly couple owned it, and Jake courted them for over a year. He saw this as the listing that would cement his reputation in the luxury market. But he had a rival, Marcus, an agent from a bigger firm whom Jake hated. He was paranoid that Marcus would swoop in. Jake spent months monitoring the mansion, calling the sellers constantly, even paying for drone footage before the property hit the market. Meanwhile, I was working on a community theatre production. I had a small role and was running sound design. The director was a new guy named David, recently relocated from Chicago. He'd worked in professional theatre there and brought fresh energy to our group. We hit it off, often staying after rehearsal to talk shop. One night David mentioned he was buying a house here and asked if I knew a good agent. Without much thought, I gave him Jake's card. I figured despite his attitude, Jake was good at his job. Maybe a successful deal would mellow him out. Weeks went by. I got busy with show prep while Jake spiraled about the mansion. Then, 2 weeks before opening night, he called me in a rage. The sellers had accepted a cash offer. Asking price. No contingencies. Closing in 2 weeks. Jake was sure Marcus had stolen the deal. He called everyone in the family, ranting about sabotage and how his career was ruined. Then came the day of closing. Jake drove by the mansion and saw David, my director, on the porch with the keys. He immediately called me, screaming that I'd betrayed him, set him up, orchestrated the entire thing as revenge for years of theatre insults. The truth? Jake had dismissed David. When David called him after handing him the card, Jake sized him up, assumed he wasn't wealthy enough, and brushed him off, suggesting he try agents who specialized in starter homes. David then found Marcus, who treated him seriously and showed him properties, including the mansion. David had the money from selling his Chicago property and fell in love with the house, especially since it had a ballroom perfect for hosting art events. But Jake refused to see that. Instead, he built a conspiracy theory where I masterminded the whole thing to humiliate him. He told our parents I'd sabotaged him. They called me, disappointed, asking for my side, and my sister wanted the truth. Family gatherings exploded with drama. Meanwhile, our show opened that same weekend, and it was a success. For a few hours each night, I could forget Jake's meltdown. But between shows, I got non-stop texts and calls about how I'd supposedly destroyed his career. At the cast party, David thanked me for referring him, but admitted Jake had been incredibly unprofessional. Jake had basically judged him on his clothes and income assumptions and dismissed him outright. David said Marcus listened, respected his needs, and helped him find the perfect home. The irony? Jake lost the sale not because of me or Marcus, but because of his own arrogance. That's when it hit me. For years, Jake mocked theatre as a waste of time, insisting real estate was for serious people, but his own prejudice cost him over $20,000 in commission. He couldn't see that someone from my little hobby world could also be a serious buyer. Now my family thinks I'm some manipulative schemer. Jake is convinced I ruined his career. I keep replaying it, wondering if I should feel guilty. I genuinely didn't plan for this, but part of me feels vindicated. Jake spent years tearing me down for loving something meaningful to me, and karma handed him the harshest lesson. Dismissing people makes you lose opportunities. If Jake had treated David with basic respect, the deal would have been his. Instead, his narrow view of success sabotaged him. But now I'm stuck as the supposed villain in my family's eyes. So here I am wondering, AITA for handing David my brother's card without warning him? Should I have prepped Jake, told him to take the call seriously, or is Jake fully responsible for losing the deal because of his arrogance? I didn't want this outcome, but I can't say I'm entirely sorry either. What do you think? Did I cross a line, or is this just karma working itself out? Update 1. I wasn't expecting my post to blow up, but thank you to everyone who commented. Reading your responses helped me process things. A lot of you said I literally just gave someone a business card, which is exactly what I've been trying to tell my family. It's validating to hear that from outsiders. Unfortunately, things with Jake have only gotten worse. On Monday, he drove by David's new house and saw what looked like a small gathering in the backyard. Jake immediately assumed David was throwing a party to rub his success in Jake's face. That evening, Jake called me, furious, demanding to know what kind of celebration I was planning with my theatre friends. I told him I wasn't even there, but he was convinced this was part of my elaborate revenge plot. Turns out David had just invited some of the cast and crew from our production over to see his new place. I wasn't there, but my friend Sarah told me it was just a casual get-together. David gave everyone a tour and mentioned his ideas about hosting cultural events in the future. Completely innocent, but Jake twisted it into proof that I orchestrated the entire sale to humiliate him. He even accused me of convincing someone to spend over $1 million just to get back at him, which shows how detached from reality he's gotten. My mom called soon after. Jake had been at their house for dinner and ranted the whole time about how I'd sabotaged him. He's now telling everyone I've always been jealous of his success and deliberately targeted the Victorian mansion because I knew how much it mattered to him. My dad, who usually avoids family drama, even called to ask me directly if I'd planned this. I explained again. David asked for a referral. I gave him Jake's card. Jake dismissed him, and Marcus got the sale. Dad seemed to believe me, but also suggested I might want to apologize just to keep the peace, since Jake's hurting over losing such a big commission. That's where I'm struggling. On one hand, I know losing 20 grand sucks, but on the other hand, giving someone a business card isn't sabotage, and I don't think I should apologize for Jake's failure to treat a client with respect. My sister's trying to mediate. She thinks if Jake and I sat down together, maybe he'd finally hear the full story and realize it was just a coincidence. But I'm not sure Jake is capable of listening right now. He's so fixated on his conspiracy theory that logic doesn't seem to matter. Meanwhile, people from the theatre community have been thanking me for connecting David with an agent, not realizing it was my brother or that this caused so much drama. They just see it as me being helpful. The contrast is wild. Jake thinks I'm a mastermind plotting against him, while others think I was doing a good deed. I thought about reaching out to David, maybe asking him to clarify what happened with Jake, but that feels unfair to David. He has no idea his home purchase caused a family meltdown, and dragging him into it would just create more awkwardness. The most frustrating part is Jake's refusal to admit his own behavior cost him the client. Even if I hadn't given David his card, David would have found another agent anyway. Jake judged him by appearances, assumed he wasn't worth his time, and pushed him away. That's not on me. It's ironic because Jake has spent years mocking me for community theatre, insisting I needed to network with people who mattered, but it was one of those wannabe actors he dismissed, who turned out to have the money for $1 million house. Jake's prejudices didn't just hurt my feelings, they lost him real money. Still, I wonder if I should have seen this coming. I knew Jake despised theatre people, and I knew he was obsessed with that listing. Should I have realized giving David his card might end badly? Was I naive, or maybe subconsciously hoping karma would bite him? Honestly, I don't think I planned anything vengeful. It felt like the normal thing to do when someone asked for a referral, but now that it's played out like this, I can't deny a small part of me thinks Jake got what he deserved. The pressure from my family to apologize is intense. They think it would calm things down, but if I apologize, Jake will take it as confirmation that I sabotaged him, and he'll never confront his own arrogance. If I don't apologize, the rift will probably deepen. So that's where I'm at. Do I apologize just to keep the peace, even though I don't think I did anything wrong? Do I keep defending myself and hope Jake eventually accepts the truth, or do I just step back and let them believe what they want and protect my own peace? Update 2. Well, things just took a turn I never expected. I'm not sure if it makes this whole situation better or worse, just a lot more complicated. Yesterday, David called and asked if we could meet for coffee. His tone was serious, so I assumed he'd found out about the family drama and wanted to apologize for being at the center of it. Instead, he told me he'd heard through the theatre community that there was some conflict tied to his house purchase and wanted to understand what happened. Sarah had apparently let slip that my brother was upset about losing the listing, and David connected the dots. So I told him everything, how I gave Jake his card, how Jake dismissed him, and how Jake now thinks I masterminded the sale as revenge. David listened quietly and then said something that floored me. He'd actually known Jake's name before I ever gave him the card. 3 weeks earlier, David had been at a Chamber of Commerce mixer where Jake was loudly mocking community theatre near the bar. According to David, Jake told a group of people that his sister was still playing dress-up with wannabe actors instead of having a real career, and got laughs by describing theatre folks as grown adults clinging to childhood fantasies. As someone who had worked professionally in theatre, David found it offensive and made a mental note to never work with Jake. When I later gave him Jake's card, David recognized the name immediately but decided to give him a chance for my sake. Unfortunately, Jake lived down to expectations, writing David off for his casual clothes and non-profit background, suggesting he'd be better off with a condo. Within 10 minutes, David had decided he wanted nothing to do with him. Here's the kicker. David had already been eyeing that Victorian mansion before we ever met. He'd seen the listing months earlier but hadn't settled on an agent. After Jake dismissed him, David went to Marcus, not only because Marcus was professional, but because he wanted to be sure Jake didn't get the commission. So while Jake thinks I orchestrated an elaborate scheme, the truth is that David had already ruled him out long before I entered the picture. If anything, my referral gave Jake a chance he wouldn't otherwise have had, but he blew it. David felt bad that his purchase had sparked family drama for me, but he wanted me to know it was Jake's behavior alone that cost him the sale. Then he told me something that reframed everything. Jake's mockery at that networking event was the reason David got more involved with the theatre community in the first place. He'd planned to stay low-key after moving, but hearing someone trash talk theatre motivated him to connect with local groups and offer support, which eventually led him to direct our production where we met. In other words, Jake's own words set the entire chain of events in motion. Karma in its most complicated form. I left that meeting feeling vindicated but also hurt. On one hand, it was a relief to know I hadn't been manipulative. Jake had torpedoed himself. On the other, finding out he mocked me publicly to business contacts stung. I knew he belittled my theatre involvement at family gatherings, but realizing he turned me into a joke in professional spaces felt like a deeper betrayal. I told my sister everything. She said she wasn't surprised Jake blew the consultation because he's always judged people superficially. But she also pointed out that what he said at the mixer wasn't harmless teasing. It was disrespectful and could have damaged my reputation. She thinks I should tell the family the full story. If they knew Jake's own actions lost him the client, maybe they'd stop pressuring me to apologize and even confront him about his behavior. But I'm hesitant. If I share David's account, Jake will feel exposed and humiliated, and he'll probably blame me even more. Plus, admitting I discussed it with David might make him feel I dragged the conflict outside the family. At the same time, I'm tired of being blamed while Jake plays the victim. My parents still hint that an apology would smooth things over, and Jake is now threatening to cut me off if I don't admit what I did. The impossible choice is this: stay quiet and shoulder blame for something I didn't do, or tell the truth and risk escalating the conflict. Either way, Jake refuses to acknowledge his own role in losing the deal. He still acts like the commission was rightfully his, stolen from him by my supposed scheming, instead of lost because he insulted whole communities and dismissed a serious buyer. At least now I know for certain the truth. I didn't sabotage him. His arrogance and disrespect created this mess, not me. Whether the rest of my family will ever believe that's another question entirely. Update 3. I'm writing this update from David's house, actually, which is surreal considering how this whole story started. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me explain what happened over the past few days, because honestly, I couldn't have made this up if I tried. After my last update, I spent a couple of days wrestling with whether to tell my family what David had revealed about the networking event. I was leaning towards keeping it to myself, mostly because I didn't want to make the situation worse. But then Jake forced my hand in the most dramatic way possible. On Tuesday morning, Jake showed up at my apartment unannounced. I was getting ready for work when he started pounding on my door, shouting for me to let him in because he knew I was home. When I opened the door, he pushed past me into my living room and immediately started yelling about how I'd ruined his life and destroyed his career. He was more upset than I'd ever seen him, red-faced and shaking with anger. It took me a few minutes to piece together what had set him off this time. Apparently, Jake had run into Marcus at a coffee shop the previous evening, and Marcus had made some comment about how Jake should be more careful about prejudging potential clients. Marcus implied that David was exactly the kind of buyer Jake claimed to specialize in, but that Jake had dismissed him too quickly to realize it. In Jake's mind, this confirmed that Marcus and I had been working together all along to embarrass him and steal his client. He accused me of feeding information to Marcus about the Victorian Mansion listing, of coordinating with David to make Jake look bad, of spending months planning an elaborate scheme to destroy his reputation in the real estate community. I tried to calm Jake down and explain once again that I had literally just given David a business card. But Jake was beyond listening to reason. He started yelling about how I'd always been jealous of his success, how I'd been looking for ways to tear him down since we were kids, how I couldn't stand that he'd made something of himself while I was still playing with toys in community theatre. And that's when Jake crossed a line he'd never crossed before. He started attacking not just my involvement in theatre, but my intelligence, my career, my life choices, everything. He called me pathetic for being nearly 30 and still pretending that community theatre mattered. He said I was delusional if I thought any of my theatre friends would ever amount to anything. He told me I was an embarrassment to the family and that he was ashamed to be related to someone so immature and vindictive. But the thing that really got to me was when Jake said that he'd been telling people for years that I was mentally unstable, that my obsession with theatre was a sign that I couldn't handle real adult responsibilities. He said he'd been covering for me with extended family and friends, making excuses for why I wasn't married or buying a house or living what he considered a normal adult life. And that's when I completely lost it. I told Jake about my conversation with David, about how David had overheard him mocking me in community theatre at the networking event, about how Jake's own dismissive attitude had cost him the client before I was ever involved. I explained that David had already been interested in the Victorian mansion and had only worked with Marcus because Jake had been so unprofessional during their consultation. Jake's face went through about 5 different emotions as I told him the story. First confusion, and then disbelief, and then anger, and finally this horrible realization that maybe, just maybe, he'd brought this on himself. But instead of acknowledging that his behavior had consequences, he doubled down. He accused me of lying about the networking event, claimed I'd probably paid David to make up the story, and insisted that this just proved how elaborate my revenge plot had been. The argument escalated to the point where my upstairs neighbor started knocking on the floor, clearly annoyed by the shouting. Jake stormed out, slamming my door so hard that a picture fell off the wall. As he left, he yelled that he was done with me permanently and that I shouldn't bother showing up to any family events because he never wanted to see me again. I called in sick to work that day because I was so shaken up by the confrontation. I'd never seen Jake that angry, and some of the things he'd said about me were genuinely cruel. The part about telling people I was mentally unstable particularly bothered me because it made me wonder how many family, friends, and professional contacts had gotten a skewed impression of me based on Jake's comments. That evening, my sister called to tell me that Jake had been over to my parents' house, demanding that they choose between him and me. According to her, Jake had given them an ultimatum. Either they cut off contact with me entirely, or he was going to limit his involvement with the family. He'd apparently told them that I was dangerous and manipulative, that keeping me around was going to cause more problems for everyone, and that he couldn't trust me not to sabotage other areas of his life. My parents were apparently pretty shaken by Jake's ultimatum. They didn't want to lose contact with either of their children, but they also didn't fully understand what was happening or why Jake was so convinced I'd done something terrible. My sister said they were talking about having some kind of family meeting to hash everything out, but she wasn't sure if that would help or make things worse. The next day, I got a completely unexpected phone call from David. He said he'd heard through the theatre community that there was ongoing family drama related to his house purchase, and he wanted to know if there was anything he could do to help clarify the situation. I told him about my confrontation with Jake, about Jake's ultimatum to my parents, and about how the whole family was being torn apart by this misunderstanding. David was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that surprised me. He offered to meet with my parents directly to explain exactly what had happened during his interactions with Jake, both at the networking event and during their business consultation. David said he felt partially responsible for the family conflict, even though it wasn't really his fault, and he wanted to help resolve it if possible. At first, I wasn't sure if involving David directly was a good idea. It seemed like it might make Jake even angrier and could put David in an awkward position with people he didn't really know. But David insisted he didn't mind, and honestly, I was running out of options for getting my family to understand the truth. I called my parents and asked if they'd be willing to meet with David so he could explain his perspective on what had happened, and my dad was hesitant at first, saying he didn't want to drag outsiders into family business, but my mom pointed out that David was already involved, whether they liked it or not. They agreed to meet with him, partly because they were desperate to understand what was really going on. The meeting happened yesterday afternoon at my parents' house. I was incredibly nervous, not knowing how David would come across to my parents or whether they'd believe his version of events. David was professional and respectful, explaining the timeline clearly and answering all their questions honestly. He told them about overhearing Jake's comments at the networking event, about how those comments had influenced his decision to get more involved with community theatre, and about how dismissive Jake had been during their business consultation. David was careful to emphasize that I had genuinely been trying to help both of them by making the introduction, and that I couldn't have predicted or planned how things would work out. My parents asked David directly if he thought I'd done anything manipulative or vengeful, and David's response was exactly what I needed them to hear. He said that in his experience, I'd been nothing but helpful and professional, that giving someone a business card was a completely normal thing to do, and that any problems with the real estate transaction had been caused by Jake's own attitude and behavior. After David left, my parents called me to say they finally understood what had really happened. My mom apologized for pressuring me to apologize to Jake, and my dad said he was disappointed in Jake for letting his prejudices cost him a client and for blaming me for his own mistakes. They were both upset to learn about Jake's comments at the networking event and his ultimatum about cutting off contact with me. But here's the really unexpected part. My mom asked if I thought David would be interested in joining us for dinner sometime. Not to discuss the real estate drama, but just because they'd been impressed with him as a person. She said it was clear that David was exactly the kind of thoughtful, successful person they'd want me to be friends with, and they couldn't understand why Jake had been so dismissive of him. So that's how I ended up at David's house tonight, having dinner and helping him plan a small housewarming gathering for next weekend. My parents are coming, along with several people from the theatre community and some of David's other local friends. David insisted on hosting it, partly to show that there were no hard feelings about the family drama, and partly because he genuinely wants to build connections in this new community. Jake obviously is not invited. My parents tried calling him to explain what they'd learned from David, but Jake apparently hung up on them when they started defending me. He's still convinced that everyone is lying to protect me, and he's sticking to his ultimatum about limiting family contact. My sister thinks he might come around eventually, but honestly, I'm not sure I want him to at this point. The weirdest part about all this is that I'm actually grateful for how everything worked out. Yes, it's sad that my relationship with Jake is probably irreparably damaged, and I wish the family conflict could have been avoided. But I also feel like I finally understand who Jake really is and what he thinks of me, which is painful, but also liberating in a way. For years, I let Jake make me feel small and defensive about something I'm passionate about. I questioned whether community theatre was really worthwhile, whether I was wasting my time with people who didn't matter, and whether I should be more focused on conventional measures of success. But this whole experience has shown me that the community I've built through theatre is filled with genuinely good people who support each other and contribute meaningfully to our local culture. David's involvement in resolving the family conflict is just one example of how The theatre community takes care of its own. People I've worked with on shows have been checking in on me throughout this drama, offering support and advice and perspective when I needed it most. These are the same people Jake dismissed as wannabes and dreamers, but they've shown more loyalty and integrity than he ever did. I'm also proud of myself for not backing down or apologizing for something I didn't do, even when the family pressure was intense. It would have been easier to just say I was sorry and try to move on, but standing up for the truth was important, even when it was uncomfortable. As for Jake, I hope he eventually gets some perspective on what happened and maybe learns something about how his attitudes affect other people. But I'm not holding my breath. Some people are so invested in being right that they can't acknowledge when they're wrong, even when the evidence is overwhelming. I never thought a simple business card referral would lead to all this drama, but I'm glad it happened. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show you who really has your back and what actually matters in your life. Jake spent years telling me that community theatre was a waste of time, but it turned out that my theatre connections led to one of the most meaningful friendships I've ever made, helped me stand up to family pressure, and showed me that I've been building exactly the kind of life I want to live. So no, I don't think I'm the problem here. I think I'm someone who tried to help two people I cared about, refused to be blamed for someone else's mistakes, and learned some important lessons about family, integrity, and the value of community along the way. Stay tuned for more stories from Our Girl Relationships.